The conquest of the Inca Empire is the most extreme underdog story in history. A few hundred Spaniards toppled an empire with an army of over 100,000. It has been used as the justification for European supremacy, to push a narrative of indigenous Americans lacking sophistication, a story of good, Christianity, triumphing over evil, paganism, and more. The full story, however, paints a different picture. Yes, the Spanish conquered the empire, but I had always thought the conquest ended rather abruptly. Atahualpa is captured, gives the Spanish a room full of gold for his ransom, is executed, and the Spanish take over. In reality, Atahualpa was not the last Inca emperor, and the empire would not be toppled for another 40 years. During those 4 decades, the Inca fought ferociously and performed military maneuvers of extreme genius. The battle for control of the empire was a stalemate for many of those years, and luck had much to do with it, as well as Spain's ability to ship hundreds of new reserve forces to Peru. The few hundred men Pizarro arrived with would never have conquered the empire alone. The Spanish were lucky in more ways. They arrived just as a brutal civil war had concluded that greatly divided the empire, allowing the Spanish to recruit locals from the region to aid them in conquest. Had the empire been united, the Spanish would likely have not been successful. The arrival of the Spanish also followed a smallpox epidemic which had crippled the empire. In fact, smallpox caused the Inca Civil War. The previous emperor, Huayna Capac, died of smallpox, and so did his successor. This caused his 2 sons, who are half-brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, to engage in a battle for succession. One final note is that much like the forces of Hernando Cortés in Mexico, Pizarro and his men were in awe of the civilization they encountered. The architectural and agricultural engineering of the Inca Empire was like nothing they had ever seen. They also recognized and feared the Inca army. The acts of devastation, slaughter, barbary, and arson were strategic military choices often made in desperation, rather than pointless acts of erasure, which does stand in contrast to Cortés, who destroyed Tenochtitlan out of spite. I say this not to excuse their actions, but to combat the harmful myths of a superior group conquering a primitive group. Those who claim this is the case would be in the awkward position of disagreeing with the very Spanish who conquered the empire. The conquistadors revered the Inca for their beauty, resolve, determination, intelligence, organization, standard of living, and more. The Inca did not call themselves by that name. That was the name of their leader. It's equivalent to referring to Americans as the presidents. The Inca referred to themselves as Tawantinsuyu, a name that can also refer to the empire itself, just like Americans live in America. For the sake of ease, I will still refer to them as the Inca and their empire as the Inca Empire. The Incas, originally a small ethnic group from the Cuzco Valley, had expanded their territory dramatically over the century prior to the arrival of the Spanish, creating an empire stretching 2,500 miles. Before the Incas, several civilizations had risen and fallen in the Andes and coastal Peru. The Moche, Tiwanaku, and Chimu were among the most notable, each contributing to the region's complex political and social structures. The first people to inhabit South America arrived between 12,500 and 15,000 years ago. These early inhabitants gradually developed agriculture, domesticating animals like llamas and alpacas, and cultivating crops such as potatoes and quinoa. This agricultural development eventually led to the rise of settled communities and, over time, larger and more complex societies. By 900, the Tiwanaku civilization, based around Lake Titicaca, had flourished for over 7 centuries, constructing monumental architecture and supporting a large population. Further north, the Chimu Empire expanded along the coast, dominating the region until the Incas rose to power. Had the Spanish arrived in Peru a century earlier, it's likely they would have encountered the Chimu Empire instead of the Incas. As the Chimu Empire thrived, building irrigation systems and collecting labor taxes, the small Inca kingdom to the south was undergoing a dramatic expansion. This expansion was led by Kusi Yupanqui, later known as Pachacuti, the Inca equivalent of Alexander the Great. In the early 15th century, the Inca kingdom was confined to the Cuzco Valley, but Pachacuti transformed this small state into a vast empire. The Incas, like other Andean kingdoms, were built on warfare, where the size of a kingdom determined its strength. The kingdom of the Chancas, a neighboring power, threatened the Incas, prompting Pachacuti to rally allies and defeat them in battle, a turning point that expanded Inca influence. After this victory, Pachacuti reorganized the capital, Cuzco, and embarked on campaigns to annex neighboring territories. Pachacuti's son, Tupac Inca, continued the expansion, conquering the Chimu Empire and expanding Inca control even further, creating the Tawantinsuyu, or the Four Parts United. This massive empire, ruled by a small elite, taxed the labor of peasants to maintain its strength and wealth. By the time Pachacuti's grandson, Huayna Capac, took to the throne, the empire had reached its peak, expanding from present-day southern Colombia to central Chile. However, the empire's stability was soon threatened by the arrival of European-introduced diseases like smallpox, which devastated the population. Huayna Capac himself fell victim to the disease, setting off a succession crisis that would further weaken the Inca Empire. After smallpox devastated the Aztecs, it spread southward, reaching the Inca Empire. The disease killed Emperor Huayna Capac, sparking a brutal war of succession between his sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Inca succession traditionally involved bloody struggles, where the most cunning and aggressive contender seized the throne. The lack of a designated heir intensified the conflict between the half-brothers. Atahualpa, a skilled military leader, controlled seasoned troops in the north. Meanwhile, Huáscar, less interested in military affairs, led an inexperienced army from the south. Huáscar launched an attack, but his forces were quickly defeated. Atahualpa captured and executed Huáscar's general, Atoc, using his skull as a drinking cup. Atahualpa's forces continued their advance south, eventually capturing Huáscar near Cuzco. Atahualpa's generals paraded their victory, stripping Huáscar of his royal insignia. The aftermath was violent and ruthless. Huáscar's family was executed in a brutal display, solidifying Atahualpa's control. This internal conflict left the empire weak, just as Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish conquistadors arrived, ready to exploit these divisions. When Francisco Pizarro arrived in Tumbes in 1532, he quickly learned of the civil war between two brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa. Tumbes, once a thriving city, was in ruins due to its allegiance to Huáscar, who was defeated by Atahualpa. Atahualpa, the more successful of the two brothers, was camped with his army in the Andes about 200 miles away. The Spaniards were excited by the prospect of capitalizing on these internal divisions, similar to how Hernando Cortés had exploited local rivalries to defeat the Aztecs. Pizarro saw the opportunity to form alliances, manipulate the situation, and ultimately control both sides. But first, he needed to make contact with Atahualpa, who was known to have a large army. Pizarro's expedition now embarked on a challenging ascent into the Andes, becoming the first Europeans to enter the vast mountain range. Along the way, they encountered desolate towns and villages, many of which had been destroyed during the Civil War. The sight of dead natives hanging by their feet underscored the brutality of the conflict. The Spaniards pressed on, interrogating and even torturing locals to extract information about Atahualpa's intentions. Their informants warned that Atahualpa planned to kill the Spaniards, heightening their anxiety as they continued their journey. At night, the Spaniards camped in freezing cold, sheltered makeshift tents. They were 168 strong, 106 on foot, and 62 on horseback, though they had no clear idea of how large Atahualpa's army was. Nevertheless, they marched forward, relying on their superior weapons, horses, and tactics. Pizarro was accompanied by his 4 half-brothers, Hernando, Juan, Gonzalo, and Francisco Martin, all of whom had little experience in native conquests. Also in the group was Hernando de Soto, a dashing adventurer who would later become famous for his exploration of Florida. On November 15th, 1532, the Spaniards finally reached the valley of Cajamarca, where Atahualpa's army was encamped. The vast number of tents stretched across the landscape, giving the Spaniards their first glimpse of the might of the Inca army. They were both awed and fearful, realizing they were up against a formidable and numerous force. However, they maintained their composure, aware that any sign of weakness could lead to their defeat at the hands of not only the Incas, but also the native porters traveling with them. The Spaniards entered the town of Cajamarca in military formation, their horse hooves clacking against stone streets. The town appeared deserted, its inhabitants either hiding or having fled. The town itself was impressive, with large stone buildings and a vast plaza surrounded by mountains. Pizarro's forces set up camp, preparing for their fateful encounter with Atahualpa, an event that would forever alter the course of South American history. When Francisco Pizarro and his men arrived at the town of Cajamarca, they positioned themselves in the main square, a secure location with only 2 entrances, where they could plan their next steps. As hail fell, they took shelter in nearby stone buildings. When no messenger came from Atahualpa, Pizarro sent Captain Hernando de Soto with a group of horsemen to request a meeting. De Soto, experienced in conquest and admired for his bravery, was well suited for this task. De Soto and his men rode through crowds of silent Inca soldiers, crossing rivers on horseback as they neared Atahualpa's camp. Soto eventually came face to face with the Inca emperor, seated on a low stool surrounded by his nobles. Despite the unusual sight of a foreigner on a massive horse, Atahualpa remained composed, not even glancing up at the Spaniards. Soto delivered a prepared speech, explaining that the Spaniards had come to teach the Inca about Christianity and requested peace and cooperation. However, Atahualpa, still in the final day of a ceremonial fast, showed little interest in the Spaniards' message. The interpreter, Felipio, struggled to communicate the Spaniards' intent due to his limited language skills, which may have contributed to the Inca emperor's lack of response. Atahualpa eventually spoke after Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's brother, arrived, asking about the mistreatment of his chiefs by the Spaniards and the killing of 3 Christians. His calm yet serious demeanor suggested he was aware of the Spaniards' activities, but remained unimpressed by their presence. The Inca emperor's court observed the Spaniards with amazement, but also noted their disregard for Inca customs, as they sat arrogantly on their horses, instead of showing the customary deference to the emperor. This encounter marked the first face-to-face meeting between Atahualpa and the Spaniards, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would follow in the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. Hernando Pizarro, known for his arrogance, denied the Incas' report of Spanish casualties, mocking the suggestion that indigenous forces could harm the Spaniards. He claimed that neither the Spaniards nor their horses could be killed by what he called mere chickens. Hernando emphasized that the Spaniards only attacked those who opposed them and promised that Atahualpa would soon see the might of the Spaniards in battle. While Hernando exuded confidence, the Spaniards were acutely aware of their precarious situation. Their mission, authorized by the Spanish crown, aimed to conquer the Inca Empire and seize its wealth, much like Cortés had done with the Aztecs. Atahualpa, on the other hand, viewed the small group of Spaniards as little threat, confident that he could easily crush them if necessary. His decision to allow Spaniards to reach Cajamarca had been driven more by curiosity than fear. In response to Hernando's boastful claims, Atahualpa suggested that the Spaniards join him in quelling a rebellious provincial chief. Hernando, brimming with confidence, declared that only 10 Spaniards on horseback would suffice to defeat the chief, a statement that amused Atahualpa, who smiled at what he perceived as an absurd overconfidence. During this tense exchange, Hernando de Soto observed Atahualpa's interest in the Spaniards' horses, which were entirely new to the Inca. Sensing an opportunity to impress, Soto performed a dramatic display of horsemanship, charging his horse at Atahualpa's guards, who fled in fear. Although Atahualpa remained composed, his soldiers' reaction broke Inca military discipline. That evening, Atahualpa ordered the execution of his guards for their cowardice, ensuring that discipline was maintained. As the evening darkened, Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, ordered drinks of chicha, a corn beer, to be brought out. The Spaniards were hesitant, suspecting the beverage might be poisoned, but eventually drank under the emperor's insistence. With night falling, Hernando Pizarro asked permission to leave and inquired what message he should take back to his brother. Atahualpa said he would visit Cajamarca the next day to meet with their leader, Francisco Pizarro. Unbeknownst to the Spaniards, Atahualpa had already made up his mind to capture and kill most of them. He planned to castrate a few to serve as eunuchs in his harem and to breed their horses to increase his empire's power. Although Atahualpa understood little of the Spaniards' words, their arrogance convinced him they posed no significant threat. When the two Hernandos returned to Cajamarca, they reported their meeting with Atahualpa to Francisco and the other Spaniards. They described Atahualpa's majesty, his massive army, and his anger over the Spaniards' prior actions on the coast. The realization that they were vastly outnumbered, possibly by a ratio of 400 to 1, deeply unsettled the Spaniards. They considered various strategies, allying with the emperor or capturing him, as Cortés had done with the Aztec emperor Moctezuma. But all options seemed fraught with risk. None of the Spaniards slept easily that night, and many feared they had walked into a deadly trap. Miguel de Estede, a notary, wrote that the Spaniards were terrified and spent the night discussing their grim situation. From the square, they could see the fires of Atahualpa's massive army lighting up the hillsides, creating a fearsome, almost star-like sight. The Spaniards knew that the next day would bring a decisive and dangerous confrontation. On the night before the decisive encounter with Atahualpa, Pedro de Candia, the captain of artillery, prepared the Spaniards' limited weaponry, 4 cannons and fewer than a dozen harquebuses, which were primitive guns. Some soldiers sharpened their swords, while others sought spiritual solace from Friar Vicente de Valverde, confessing their sins and praying. Pizarro moved through the camp, encouraging his men to trust in God, reminding them that all events, good or bad, were part of his divine will. Pizarro, who had spent 30 years chasing this dream, now faced the greatest challenge of his career, defeating an Inca army numbering in the tens of thousands. His reputation, his leadership of 167 conquistadors, and his ambitions of ruling an empire all hinged on what would happen the next day. As he wandered the camp, gazing at the distant fires of the Inca army, he knew everything depended on the decision he would make. The following morning, on November 16th, 1532, the Spaniards woke to a cold but clear day. Pizarro prepared his men, positioning the cavalry and foot soldiers inside 3 stone buildings around the square. His plan was flexible, ready to adapt to whatever scenario unfolded when Atahualpa arrived. The signal to attack would be the firing of the cannons if it seemed likely they would capture the emperor. Meanwhile, in the Inca camp, Atahualpa rose late, celebrated the capture of his rival Huascar, and drank chicha, feeling confident in his impending victory. He believed the Spaniards posed no serious threat and was prepared to deal with them after uniting his empire. By midday, the Inca legions began to march in formation toward Cajamarca, where Pizarro and his men waited tensely, ready for battle. However, as the native army approached, it suddenly halted just outside the town, leaving the Spaniards in suspense as to what would happen next. As Atahualpa's procession halted outside the town of Cajamarca, Pizarro, worried that the trap he had carefully laid might be exposed, sent Hernando de Aldana to urge the Inca emperor to proceed into the square. Using limited runasimi, the language of the Inca, and hand gestures, Aldana successfully conveyed the message. Soon, the Inca army resumed its movement, with Atahualpa carried in an elaborate litter adorned with gold, silver, and feathers, and surrounded by his elite warriors. As the Inca entered the plaza, Pizarro and his brother Hernando made final rounds, encouraging their troops to trust in God despite being vastly outnumbered. The square filled with thousands of warriors, but Atahualpa had left the bulk of his forces outside the town, confident that the small number of Spaniards posed no real threat. Atahualpa's grand entrance was met with silence from the hidden Spaniards. The emperor called out, expecting them to reveal themselves, but only 2 figures emerged: Friar Vicente de Valverde and the interpreter Felipio. Valverde attempted to persuade Atahualpa to meet with Pizarro, but the emperor refused. It was at this point that Valverde delivered the Requerimiento, a declaration asserting the divine right of the Spanish monarchy to rule over the newly discovered lands and demanding Atahualpa's submission. Confused and unimpressed by the speech, Atahualpa requested to see the prayer book that Valverde held. Unfamiliar with what books are, the emperor dismissed it after examining it briefly and threw it to the ground. This act enraged Valverde, who rushed back to Pizarro, urging the Spaniards to attack the arrogant dogs who had insulted the Christian faith. As the tension in Cajamarca mounted, Pizarro made the fateful decision to strike. Signaling Pedro de Candia, the cannons roared into action, unleashing a deadly volley into the mass of unsuspecting Inca warriors. The Spanish harquebuses followed suit, and the sudden explosion, smoke, and falling bodies threw the native troops into chaos. The Spaniards mounted on their armored horses, burst from their hiding places, screaming and charging with swords and lances, cutting down warriors as they rushed to escape through the narrow exits. It's impossible to imagine the terror this would have inflicted. The Inca had never seen an object like a cannon or primitive gun before. The projectiles are so fast that they are nearly invisible. All of a sudden, dozens of bodies would have exploded and splintered into shards of bone, chunks of flesh, and clouds of blood. At the same time that explosions, they could only liken to volcanic eruptions, were taking place. The Inca soldiers, confident moments earlier, found themselves trapped in a deadly ambush. The unfamiliar sight of horses and the brutal assault of the well-armed Spaniards left them panicked and disorientated. They surged toward the exits, trampling one another in their desperation to flee, while Spaniards methodically hacked through the crowd, showing no mercy. In the midst of this slaughter, Pizarro and his men focused on reaching Atahualpa, who remained on his litter. Though his bearers were cut down one by one, replacements quickly stepped in to hold the emperor aloft. Spanish accounts recall how men desperately held Atahualpa's litter above their heads, even as Spanish swords hacked off their hands. Pizarro himself eventually reached the litter, grabbed Atahualpa, and after a fierce struggle, succeeded in pulling him from his seat. Atahualpa was taken prisoner, marking a decisive moment in the conquest of the Inca Empire. Outside, the massacre continued as the Spaniards chased down fleeing natives, killing thousands while suffering 0 casualties of their own. The sudden and overwhelming attack left the Inca forces shattered. In just a few hours, the once mighty Inca army had been decimated, and their emperor, who had ruled over millions, was now a captive of the vastly outnumbered Spanish invaders. The Battle of Cajamarca ended with the total collapse of Inca resistance in the square, leaving the Spaniards in control of the situation. As Pizarro's forces secured their victory over the Inca, the Spanish leader attended to the captured Atahualpa, ensuring he was clothed and fed. Atahualpa, who had first encountered Pizarro when seized during battle, was now a prisoner. Pizarro, grasping control over the Inca emperor, sought to leverage Atahualpa's position to manipulate the vast empire. By keeping Atahualpa alive, Pizarro hoped to rule indirectly, extracting wealth and resources from the empire without further bloodshed. Pizarro, exaggerating past victories, attempted to convince Atahualpa that resistance was futile. He portrayed the Spaniards as merciful, though their brutal conquest was evident in the bodies of slain warriors outside. Atahualpa, recognizing the threat posed by the very small yet powerful Spanish force, responded diplomatically. He acknowledged being misled by his captains and sought to work with the Spaniards, realizing his survival depended on cooperation. Atahualpa soon offered a massive ransom of gold and silver in exchange for his life. A room 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 8 feet high, filled with gold. However, the gold and other items would have to be brought over from Cuzco, and it could take up to a year. This proposition astonished Pizarro, revealing the immense wealth of the Inca Empire. As Pizarro's men pillaged and marveled at the treasure, the conquistadors realized the vast opportunities for plunder and control in the empire. Meanwhile, Atahualpa, though captive, began to strategize how to regain his freedom, believing that time and negotiation might eventually turn the tide in his favor. In the Inca Empire, the emperor maintained loyalty through a system of redistributing state-owned goods. Lords received gifts from the emperor, which they passed down to their followers, reaching the peasants who produced the surplus. This allowed the Inca elite, a small fraction of the population, to control the empire. Atahualpa, now captive, applied this logic to his situation, offering Pizarro gold in exchange for his life. Messengers spread throughout the empire to gather gold and silver, including from temples, while Pizarro sought reinforcements to solidify his control. Gradually, the treasure began to arrive in Cajamarca, and chiefs visited Atahualpa to pay homage, affirming his status even in captivity. The Spaniards, unfamiliar with Inca reverence for their emperor, treated Atahualpa as a royal prisoner, continuing to receive treasures as part of the ransom. However, Atahualpa still had political concerns, including the threat from his brother Huáscar. Rather than uniting against the Spaniards, Atahualpa arranged for Huáscar's execution to secure his rule. The Spaniards, unaware of this, continued to use Atahualpa's influence to control the empire, though Pizarro's growing forces signal that their true intentions were conquest, not departure. As more Spaniards arrived with fresh horses and men, Atahualpa realized his hopes for freedom were fading. He grasped the full extent of the Spaniards' plan and, acknowledging that his efforts to bargain with treasure would not save him, he concluded that his fate was sealed. When Diego de Almagro arrived in Peru in 1533 with additional men and supplies, he found Tumbes in ruins just as Pizarro had, and learned of his capture of Atahualpa. Despite past tensions over titles and recognition, Pizarro had secured governorship while granting Almagro only a minor position. The two reunited amicably in Cajamarca, where Pizarro proudly showed Almagro the treasure collected as Atahualpa's ransom. Though outwardly friendly, tensions remained between the two, especially how over to divide the riches. Pizarro's original group, the men of Cajamarca, who had captured Atahualpa, were entitled to the majority of the ransom, while Almagro's men, who arrived later, would receive little. This created growing envy and frustration among the new rivals. With the ransom nearly collected, Pizarro ordered the treasure to be melted down and distributed. His men became incredibly wealthy, receiving vast amounts of gold and silver. Meanwhile, Pizarro secured 7 times more than his soldiers, making him the richest of all. But he still needed his men to stay and complete the conquest of the empire. As Hernando Pizarro went back to Spain with the king's share of the treasure, tensions escalated around Atahualpa's fate. Rumors circulated that the Inca emperor was plotting an escape, or a rescue by his northern army. This led to a division among the Spanish leaders. Some, led by Almagro, argued for Atahualpa's immediate execution, while others believed keeping him alive was key to controlling the empire. Pizarro, uncertain of Atahualpa's true intentions, faced increasing pressure as rumors of a nearby Inca army grew. The situation came to a head when a report confirmed an approaching army, convincing the Spanish leaders that executing Atahualpa was the safest course of action. The decision to kill the Inca emperor was made swiftly under mounting fear of rebellion. When the final vote was cast, all present agreed that Atahualpa must die. Even Pizarro, though reluctant, concluded that the Inca emperor had ordered the approaching army, committing treason by Spanish standards. Atahualpa was devastated when informed of his fate, pleading that his life be spared, and even offering double the ransom. His pleas were in vain, and the Spaniards prepared to execute him, offering a final chance to convert to Christianity. On July 26, 1533, 8 months and some days after the massacre in the square at Cajamarca, Atahualpa was led to the square where he had been captured months earlier. Tied to a stake, he faced his execution as a crowd of local townspeople prostrated themselves in despair, fearing the end of their world. The Spaniards, led by Friar Valverde, offered Atahualpa a choice: convert to Christianity and be garroted, that is, to be strangled slowly, or be burned alive. To protect his body and guarantee access to the afterlife, Atahualpa accepted baptism. After a brief ceremony, he was strangled by a garrote, and his body was partially burned. That night, his corpse was left in the square as the Spaniards braced for an attack that never ended up coming. The following day, Hernando de Soto returned with news that no army was nearby, leaving the Spaniards to realize that they had been deceived. Pizarro, overcome with guilt, mourned the unnecessary execution. Despite the emotional toll of Atahualpa's death, Pizarro and his men prepared for their next mission, capturing the Inca capital, Cuzco, and advancing deeper into the heart of the empire. For 3 months, Pizarro and about 300 conquistadors marched south through rugged terrain, facing minimal and disorganized resistance from local natives. They were accompanied by native guides, slaves, and llamas carrying Atahualpa's treasure. Pizarro had appointed Tupac Hualpa as the new Inca emperor, but within 2 months, Hualpa died, leaving the empire without a ruler once again. Before departing, Pizarro captured and later executed Inca general Calcuchima, reducing the Inca army's strength. Now, only General Quisquis's forces stood between the Spaniards and Cuzco. On the way, Pizarro met Manco Inca, a fugitive of royal descent who was fleeing from Atahualpa's forces. Seeing an opportunity to ally with Manco and the Cuzco faction, Pizarro gained his support, positioning the Spaniards as liberators from Atahualpa's tyranny. As the Spaniards neared Cuzco, Quisquis's army attempted to resist, but was no match for the Spaniards' horses and superior weaponry. After a fierce battle, the Inca army retreated, allowing the Spaniards to enter Cuzco unopposed on November 15th, 1533, one day shy of the massacre at Cajamarca. Once in Cuzco, Pizarro quickly consolidated power, positioning Manco Inca as a puppet emperor. The Spaniards, now confident in their control, continued plundering the city. Manco, believing the Spaniards were allies, worked to restore the empire while Pizarro focused on consolidating his rule. Meanwhile, Almagro, after negotiations with Pedro de Alvarado to prevent competing claims on Peru, prepared to take command in Cuzco. In December 1534, Pizarro learned King Charles had decided to split the Inca Empire, giving the northern part to Pizarro and the southern to Almagro, setting the stage for future conflict between the two conquistadors. In January 1535, Diego de Almagro arrived in Cuzco, appointed as lieutenant governor. He brought over 300 troops, mostly from Pedro de Alvarado's forces. Almagro learned that the king would grant him a governorship south of Pizarro's. However, no one knew exactly where the boundaries lay, fueling tensions between the two conquistadors. The arrival of Almagro's troops caused envy among the Pizarro loyalists, who had already secured wealth and encomiendas. Political divisions grew, with Almagro's men hoping to benefit from his new loyalty. Juan and Gonzalo Pizarro, determined not to lose Cuzco, clashed with Almagro's supporters, culminating in a violent confrontation between Juan Pizarro and Hernando de Soto in March 1535. Hostilities were temporarily cooled by a royal official, but tensions persisted. To avoid further conflict, Francisco Pizarro negotiated with Almagro, agreeing to support an expedition to the south, which would be within Almagro's governorship. Almagro set off in July 1535 with 570 Spaniards and 12,000 native porters, hoping to find wealth and glory in the southern Inca territories. Manco Inca, meanwhile, faced internal challenges to his rule and asked Almagro to help eliminate his rivals. Almagro's men assassinated Manco's half-brother, Atahualpa, further dividing the Inca factions. As Almagro departed for the south, Francisco Pizarro focused on establishing coastal cities. Hernando de Soto left Peru with a fortune, while Cuzco was left under the control of Manco Inca and the Pizarro brothers. Relations between the Spaniards and natives deteriorated as the Pizarro brothers pressured Manco for more gold and silver. Manco, increasingly disillusioned with the Spaniards, began secretly planning a rebellion. Reports of Spanish atrocities, including the brutal treatment of natives on Almagro's expedition, further fueled Manco's desire to resist. By late 1535, Manco began organizing a massive revolt across the Inca Empire, determined to free his people from Spanish oppression. When Manco Inca and his high priest Vilac Umu arrived in the town of Lares, they were greeted by chiefs and nobles from across the Inca Empire. The attendees represented the remaining regions loyal to Manco, though some areas like the north and coastal provinces were missing, as they had either sided with the Spaniards or remained neutral. Manco's goal was to unite the scattered parts of his empire and lead a rebellion to expel the Spaniards. Surrounded by high-ranking military leaders and nobles, Manco outlined his strategy. He planned to gather forces secretly, sending Captain Quizo Yupanqui to attack the Spaniards in Lima, while he would lead an assault on Cuzco. Manco urged the leaders to commit fully, and they did so, taking oaths to exterminate the Spanish. Meanwhile, Hernando Pizarro, realizing Manco had deceived him, sent his brother Juan with 70 cavalrymen to confront Manco's forces. When Juan arrived in the UK Valley, he found a massive Inca army already gathered. Despite their initial surprise, the Spaniards attacked but couldn't capture Manco, who had escaped. With word that native forces were also amassing near Cuzco, Juan and his men hurried back to defend the city. In the following days, Cuzco was surrounded by an enormous Inca army. The Spaniards, numbering only 196, prepared for a siege, their survival depending on cavalry and native allies. Manco continued organizing his forces, while Hernando and his men conducted skirmishes, but found themselves increasingly overwhelmed by the growing Inca forces. Despite the overwhelming odds, both sides prepared for a decisive battle to control the city. Despite killing many Inca warriors, the Spanish remained outnumbered, isolated, and faced with constant attacks. Hernando Pizarro realized that retaking the fortress of Sacsayhuaman was crucial to their survival, as it was the command center for the Inca forces. He appointed his brother Juan Pizarro to lead the assault, despite Juan's severe jaw injury. The fortress was heavily fortified with massive walls and terraces, making the attack perilous. Juan and his cavalry broke through the native forces and reached the fortress, but their assault was met with fierce resistance and heavy missile fire. After several failed attempts to breach the walls, Juan was gravely injured, cracking his skull in battle. 3 days later, he succumbed to his wounds. With Juan dead, Hernando Pizarro ordered a night assault on the fortress, using ladders to scale the walls under cover of darkness. Despite fierce resistance, the Spaniards gained ground, forcing the Inca defenders to retreat to the towers. The brave Inca commander, an Orejon noble, fought valiantly, but as the situation became hopeless, he chose to take his own life by leaping from a tower. With the commander dead and the fortress overrun, many remaining defenders also threw themselves from the walls. The Spaniards killed thousands of native warriors in the battle, while suffering relatively few losses themselves. The capture of Sacsayhuaman marked a critical, though brutal victory for the Spanish forces. Francisco Pizarro learned of Manco Inca's rebellion on May 4, 1536, just before the major assault on Cuzco. Alarmed, he sent letters promising reinforcements, but they would take months to arrive. At the time, Pizarro was in Lima, a city he had founded 4 months earlier, preoccupied with distributing encomiendas and building Spanish control over the vast Inca Empire. However, with fewer than 600 Spaniards in Peru, outnumbered nearly 10,000 to 1 by the native population, their hold on the region was fragile. Pizarro's forces were scattered across the Andes, with many trapped in Cuzco or engaged in distant conflicts. Facing the rebellion, Pizarro dispatched 2 relief forces, 30 cavalry under Juan Margovejo de Quiñones and 70 cavalry led by Gonzalo de Tapia. Unbeknownst to them, Manco had already sent his general, Quiso Yupanqui, to intercept the reinforcements. In one instance, General Quiso waited until the Spanish cavalry had crossed a river into a steep and narrow valley. The Inca had learned by now that fighting Spanish horses on level ground was suicide, but in the rugged mountains, the advantage of cavalry was gone. Suddenly, hundreds of Inca warriors charged at the unsuspecting unit. As they turned around to retreat, they discovered, to their horror, that the Inca had disassembled the bridge they had just crossed. They were trapped by the river to their rear, the incoming Inca army in front of them, and unclimbable mountain walls on either side. Then, suddenly, an enormous crash and countless shards of rock flew around them. Looking in all directions in confused shock, the Spanish saw that multiple horses and men had just been crushed like ants by a boulder. They looked up and saw Inca warriors on the top of the canyon pushing more boulders on top of them. Unable to move, the Spaniards were pulled off their horses and bludgeoned to death. Quiso decided to behead some of the Spaniards and send them, along with the unintelligible letters they carried, to Manco as a reward. Quizo's troops then annihilated another Spanish column of 60 foot soldiers led by Diego Pizarro. The town of Jauja was also overrun, with its Spanish inhabitants slaughtered. Pizarro, unaware of these losses, had already sent additional reinforcements, including a puppet Inca emperor, Cusi Rimac. But Cusi Rimac betrayed the Spaniards, leading to yet another massacre. By June 1536, General Quizo had wiped out 4 Spanish columns, eliminating nearly 200 Spaniards, including cavalry, and leaving the besieged forces in Cuzco increasingly isolated. Pizarro, desperate and fearing for his brothers trapped in Cuzco, sent urgent appeals for help to the Spanish governors, knowing that if Cuzco fell, the conquest of Peru would be lost. Meanwhile, Manco Inca, bolstered by Quizo's victories, planned further assaults, aiming to destroy the remaining Spaniards in both Cuzco and Lima, hoping to restore the Inca Empire to its former glory. The Spaniards in Cuzco, still cut off from outside communication, were left in the dark about the spread of the rebellion and Pizarro's efforts. Their situation increasingly became dire as the siege dragged on. After capturing Sacsayhuaman, Hernando Pizarro stationed 50 soldiers to defend the fortress, while he and the rest of the Spaniards remained in 2 buildings in Cuzco's main square. Manco Inca's forces continued to assault the city, which lay in ruins, with burned roofs and rubble-filled streets. Some captains suggested a breakout mission to seek help on the coast, but others warned it would be a suicide mission. Despite the risk, Hernando prepared for a group of 15 cavalrymen to attempt an escape. However, the day before their departure, in an attempt to horrify them, the Incas gave the Spanish the severed heads of the men Quizo slew and the letters they had carried. Among the letters, the Spaniards found that Francisco Pizarro was still alive, which reinvigorated them. This was a terrible mistake by the Inca, as the information helped the Spanish considerably. The mistake rests in the Inca simply not comprehending the depth of information writing contained. Some of them could speak a little Spanish, but all were illiterate. The words on the pages meant literally nothing to them, and they couldn't see the value anyone else would find in it either. Hernando canceled the escape and planned a bold attack to kill or capture Manco Inca, who was headquartered at Ollantaytambo. He led a force of cavalry, infantry, and native auxiliaries, but when they reached Ollantaytambo, they faced thousands of warriors, including Amazonian archers. Despite attempts to breach the fortress, Manco's forces repelled the Spanish. In a stroke of military genius, Manco suddenly diverted an entire river onto a low-lying field the Spanish were gathered on, submerging them in chest-deep water. Hernando ordered a retreat, with the Spaniards suffering numerous casualties and wounded horses. Meanwhile, in Lima, Francisco Pizarro faced rumors of an impending attack by General Quizo, who had successfully annihilated several Spanish columns. The city was defended by only 100 Spaniards and native auxiliaries. Quizo's army eventually appeared, surrounding the city. Despite Quizo's strategic brilliance in the mountains, his attack on flat terrain gave Pizarro's cavalry and horses the advantage. After fierce fighting, Quizo's forces retreated to the hills. On the 6th day, Quizo led a final charge, but was killed in the ensuing battle. His death shattered the Inca forces, who retreated in defeat. Manco Inca received the devastating news of Quizo's death. Realizing his finest general had been lost due to a fatal miscalculation, ordering an attack on open plains where the Spanish horses excelled. With Quizo gone, Manco's rebellion lost its momentum, and the path was clear for Spanish reinforcements, led by Diego de Almagro, to return to Peru and aid the besieged Spaniards in Cuzco. Despite General Quizo's death, Manco Inca continued the siege of Cuzco, hoping to starve out Hernando Pizarro's men. Although unable to prevent the Spaniards from resupplying, Manco's forces were strong enough to keep Hernando's troops trapped. In early 1537, Manco received news of Diego de Almagro's return to Peru with 400 Spaniards, shifting the power balance. Almagro, having failed to find riches in Chile, returned determined to seize Cuzco. Almagro sent Manco a letter offering an alliance against the Pizarros, hoping to exploit the conflict to secure his claim over Cuzco. While Manco entertained diplomatic overtures, he remained suspicious. He demanded proof of Almagro's sincerity, asking his emissaries to mutilate Hernando's messenger by cutting off his fingers, which they did, thus proving their loyalty. But when Manco tested another emissary, Ruy Diaz, by asking him to kill captured Spaniards, Diaz refused, leading Manco to imprison him. Faced with Almagro's return and the approach of another Spanish force from the north, Manco realized that his rebellion was in jeopardy. Soon after, Manco fled Ollantaytambo to seek refuge in the eastern jungle territory of the Antisuyu, accompanied by his followers, priests, and royal mummies. He addressed his chiefs, urging them to resist the Spanish, but warning them of the invaders' power. Manco's departure marked the end of his direct control over most of the Inca Empire, leaving him and his followers to regroup in the remote Antisuyu. Almagro, meanwhile, seized Cuzco, imprisoning Hernando and Gonzalo Pizarro after a brief battle. With Almagro now in control of the city, the Spanish conflict for dominance in Peru intensified, setting the stage for further clashes between the Pizarros and Almagro. After a grueling climb, Manco Inca's procession crossed the Pantacaya Pass. The snow-capped Mount Veronica loomed on their left. Below them stretched a vast sea of clouds, marking the Antis region. Manco, carried in a royal litter by the Rucana tribe, paused to reflect on his ancestors' conquests in Antisuyu. His great-grandfather, Pachacuti, first entered the region, followed by his grandfather, Tupac Inca, who had led campaigns there as well. Manco also brought their mummies with, clad in fine garments, symbolizing their enduring presence. Even in death, Inca emperors had vast power. Before departing, Manco had consulted the Quipu Kamiaks, officials responsible for royal histories, who recounted the Antisuyu's history, including Tupac Inca's conquest after a rebellion. A quipu is a collection of strings with tied knots in specific places to record information. It was not the same as writing, but recorded information. Tupac Inca, upon taking power, demanded tribute from the Antis chiefs, who saw it as servitude and rebelled. In response, Tupac Inca led a campaign into the Amazon, battling thick jungles and forming alliances with jungle nations, though the Antisuyu tribes never fully submitted. To facilitate trade with the Antis, the Incas extended roads into the region and established colonies with settlers, who acted as both cultural and military buffers. Manco and his followers journeyed through the cloud forest, reaching the Amaibamba Valley before crossing the Urubambe River into the Vilcabambe Valley, where Manco decided to settle in Vitcos, a royal estate founded by Pachacuti. From here, he hoped to rebuild his empire, protected by destroyed trails to deter Spanish invaders. Meanwhile, in Cuzco, Diego de Almagro faced a conflict with Francisco Pizarro's approaching forces. Almagro appointed Rodrigo Ordóñez to defend the city. Ordóñez led a night attack, routing troops and securing a victory for Almagro. Despite calls to execute Pizarro's brothers, Almagro hesitated, wary of provoking a full civil war. Instead, he sent Ordóñez to pursue Manco, who had taken refuge in Antisuyu. Although Ordóñez captured Manco's capital and his son Titu Cusi, Manco himself escaped into the mountains. Almagro, aging and ill, found himself increasingly isolated. When Pizarro's forces under Hernando Pizarro attacked, Ordóñez led Almagro's troops in a final stand at the Battle of Las Salinas. Outnumbered, Ordóñez fought fiercely but was ultimately killed, and Almagro fled to Sacsayhuaman. Captured and imprisoned, Almagro hoped for mercy, but Hernando Pizarro ordered his execution. On July 8, 1538, Almagro was garroted in his cell, marking the end of his ambitions and the consolidation of Pizarro's control over Cuzco. Soon after Diego de Almagro's execution, news traveled swiftly from Cuzco to the remote Amazonian Vilcabamba, Manco Inca's new capital, hidden deep within the dense jungle. Established after the Spanish sacked Vitcos, Vilcabamba was the free Inca state's stronghold. Manco, having relocated his highland followers to this unfamiliar region, fortified the city with stone buildings, coca plantations, and a thriving trading post connecting the Andes to the jungle tribes. Though the Spaniards held key cities like Cuzco and Lima, vast regions, especially the countryside, remained outside their control. Manco exploited this by orchestrating guerrilla raids and ambushes, harassing Spanish forces and supply lines. News of Almagro's death further fueled Manco's determination to resist the invaders, who he perceived as being weakened. Despite efforts to track Manco, the Spaniards struggled to locate him. Gonzalo Pizarro led a 300-man expedition into the jungle, determined to capture and kill the rebel Inca. Accompanied by native auxiliaries, including Manco's brother, Payu, the Spaniards ventured deep into the forest, only to be met with fierce resistance. Manco's warriors ambushed them with falling boulders and arrows, inflicting heavy casualties. Manco also rejected peace negotiations from his half-brothers, Inca and Huaspar, sent by the Spaniards. Enraged by their collaboration, Manco executed them both. Though the Spaniards eventually reached Vilcabamba, Manco had escaped. They captured his queen, Cura Occhio, tied her to a stake, and shot her with arrows and beat her until she died. They then threw her body into the Vilcanote River, where they knew Manco's men would find it. The sight of his wife crushed Manco. Pizarro, frustrated by his inability to capture Manco, further retaliated by executing several of Manco's high-ranking chiefs. Despite these attacks, Manco continued to lead guerrilla efforts, refusing to surrender, and the Spaniards, though they had regained control of Cuzco, remained threatened by native resistance. By June 1541, the now 63-year-old Francisco Pizarro, despite his immense wealth and power, still lived with the simplicity of his rural upbringing in the Extremadura region of Spain where he was from. Pizarro, illegitimate and raised by his mother, had used his ambition to carve a path far beyond his humble origins. Unlike his formally educated half-brothers, he forged his legacy through conquest rather than noble birth, eventually securing the title of Marquis, Governor, and Knight of the Order of Santiago. Despite his status that he had achieved, Pizarro lived simply, favoring plain clothing and spending his leisure time playing working-class games like bowls. He surrounded himself with artisans and laborers rather than the nobility, remaining humble in his daily habits. In Spain, his half-brother Hernando faced imprisonment for the execution of Diego de Almagro, Pizarro's former ally turned rival. As tensions between Pizarro's supporters and the followers of Almagro simmered, resentment among the Algamistas grew. They blamed Pizarro for their poverty and exclusion from power. On June 26, 1541, a group of about 20 Almagro supporters, led by Juan de Harada, stormed Pizarro's residence in Lima, shouting for his blood. Though Pizarro and a few local companions tried to defend themselves, they were overwhelmed. After a fierce struggle, Pizarro was fatally wounded. As he lay dying, he attempted to make the sign of a cross, but an assassin smashed his head with a vase, ending his life. In the aftermath, Manco Inca, still resisting Spanish control from his stronghold in Vilcabamba, hoped the Spaniards might destroy each other. But despite civil war, the Royalists eventually crushed Almagro's supporters, and the chaos in Peru continued. Within a year, most of Pizarro's assassins were dead, and Manco Inca harbored the few surviving Almagro supporters in his rebel kingdom. However, the Spanish renegades, seeking favor with the crown, eventually conspired to assassinate Manco. In 1544, Diego Mendez and the exiled Almagro supporters fatally stabbed Manco during a game they were playing. Though Manco's warriors avenged his death by killing the assassins, the Inca rebellion lost its leader. By 1548, only Gonzalo Pizarro remained of the famous brothers. He declared himself governor of Peru, defying the crown's authority. After leading a rebellion, Gonzalo was eventually captured and executed, marking the end of the Pizarro legacy in Peru. While the Spaniards battled for control, the Incas at Vilcabamba patiently awaited their chance to strike back. In the decades following the deaths of Manco Inca and Gonzalo Pizarro, Spain tightened its control over the former Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu. Initially led by a small group of conquistadors, the conquest was now fully under Spanish dominion. By 1560, the Spanish population in Peru had grown significantly, as had the number of African slaves. The native population, now laboring under Spanish encomenderos, endured harsh conditions far worse than under Inca rule. Meanwhile, the independent Inca kingdom of Vilcabamba persisted in the remote jungles, with traditional Inca customs, festivals, and religious practices continuing. In 1560, Titu Cusi, son of Manco Inca, became emperor. Despite Spanish offers of peace and wealth if he left Vilcabamba, Titu Cusi resisted and resumed guerrilla warfare against the Spanish. The Spanish government, facing increasing native resistance, sent emissaries to negotiate, but Titu Cusi delayed and kept his kingdom closed off. In 1569, after signing a peace treaty allowing Christian missionaries into Vilcabamba, two friars, Marcos Garcia and Diego Ortiz, arrived to spread Christianity. While Ortiz built good relations with Titu Cusi, Garcia's harsh methods angered the natives. When the friars destroyed a sacred Inca shrine, the people revolted. Titu Cusi expelled Garcia but allowed Ortiz to stay. However, after Titu Cusi's sudden death in 1571, the natives, suspecting Ortiz of sorcery, tortured and executed him. Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, seeking the end of the Inca threat, sent a military expedition to capture the new emperor Tupac Amaru. The Spanish forces overran Vilcabamba, capturing the capital and forcing Tupac Amaru into the jungle. After a long pursuit, the Spanish captured the emperor and brought him to Cuzco. Despite converting to Christianity, Tupac Amaru was tried and executed on September 24th, 1572, marking the final defeat of the Inca resistance and the end of the last independent Inca kingdom and the final Inca emperor.